Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the end of another eventful year in the fog. The highlights and low points of Year 8 of Dead by Daylight.
Now that patch 770 has arrived, along with the smattering of bug fixes that came along with it, that means that the last content update of Dead by Daylight Year 8 has arrived. And that means it's high time for an annual tradition I've been really looking forward to this year. With the anniversary chapter coming in the next couple of days, and the anniversary itself not long after, it's a good time now, I think, to look back at the last year of content to determine the best, worst, and weirdest bits of Dead by Daylight Year 8.
Just to recap, the chapters released in Year 8 were End Transmission with the Singularity and Gabriel Soma, Alien with the Xenomorph and Ellen Ripley, Chucky with, well, Chucky, and All Things Wicked with the Unknown and Sable Ward, who released alongside two half-chapters, each containing a solo survivor, Nicolas Cage and Alan Wake. The 8th anniversary in June will mark the end of Year 8, and the upcoming anniversary chapter will be the first chapter of Year 9. That's why this video is being made now and not later once we see it.
But I do of course want to reinforce that everything in this video really is just my opinion. If you've got your own list, your own preferences of what the best and worst of the year is, then that's awesome, but this is my list, so if yours is different, then tough luck, I suppose. Although I do want to reinforce that a lot of the things I'm talking about in this video are in the process of being changed, things like Chucky's Scamper or Buckle Up. But I'm still going to talk about them for two reasons. The first, these changes aren't technically coming till the start of Year 9, which means that this is still a Year 8 problem and therefore good for me to talk about. But second, and most importantly, I wrote and scripted this video and recorded it like the day before the changes got announced. So if Behaviour can't be bothered to actually change these things not at the last minute, then I can't be bothered to change my video around it. So, there, I guess.
And before I get going with the actual tangible changes to the game itself, there's been something that I've noticed over the past year that Behaviour deserves props for. Year 8 has been the year where DBD has massively ramped up their community engagement and dialogue between players and devs. It's been no coincidence that every full chapter this year has come with a livestream to show us upcoming content, not just the stuff in the chapter itself, but climatic collections and future roadmaps, and streams on the game's Discord server showcasing mid-chapter stuff as well. By itself, this would really just be advertising, but it's come with a constant stream of changes and mid-release adjustments from Behaviour that show that this desire to communicate is a two-way street. They want to be clear to us with what they're working on, and when we're clear about changes that we want to see, they tend to respond in kind.
The Behaviour of maybe a year ago would have shipped a bad change that everyone would see as bad and just send it out anyway, but Behaviour of these days, more likely to revert or tweak or just hold their hands up and say, we made a mistake, let's try it again another time. Last year I praised the accessibility and UX team, and this year I want to give a shout out to the community managers because you guys have done a class act. The feedback from this year and the reception to community feedback has been first rate, and I seriously hope this trend continues into Year 9.
But inside the game itself, there's been a second major improvement this year with implications that, if this improvement is continued, will do a lot to help mitigate one of this game's most egregious issues: maps. DBD's notoriously bad map design has been a grinding point, especially for killer players, for years, and many of us have just taken the garbageness of new maps for granted. But Behaviour has made some real strides in improving map design this year. The new maps this year have been Toba Landing, Nostromo Wreckage, and Greenville Theatre. I don't think a year has gone by where the maps released have been better than those, especially last year which brought us Garden of Joy, Borgo, New RPD and New Shelter Woods. Greenville Theatre is the best new map they've released since Midwich or Dead Dog Saloon, and is now the guardian angel that prevents survivors from guaranteeing a Garden of Joy game if they burn a Withered Isle offering. And you know what? I'll go to bat for Toba Landing here as well. I originally didn't like Toba, but it's really grown on me. The actual way the palettes of windows are constructed means the map is far more balanced than most give it credit for. And the level of detail put into its environment design is a cut above basically every other map in the game. It's teeming with strange and charming alien life. The shack and gates reflect the ancient alien structure that caused Hux to wake up and fully gain consciousness. The only real problem I'd say the map has got is the lack of visibility and visual clarity when the jungle and rocks are so densely packed, especially with such a bright colour palette. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if the map was textured and coloured like a Macmillan or Coldwind Realm instead of the pink and green, I doubt anyone would have a problem with Toba. And if you can't stand it, I've been told finding a good reshade filter helps a lot. The only L map of the year in my opinion is Nostromo. The map is very big, the resources can often be very stacked, and the main building is so big you can access it from basically anywhere on the map, kinda like Disturbed Ward, but that's still better than every map released in Year 7 of Dead by Daylight. But I don't think maps would have made a high point on this list if it wasn't for the large number of map adjustments to existing maps that also came this year, and that were generally really good. Year 8 saw reworks to Fractured Cowshed, Rancid Abattoir, both the Red Forest maps, Garden of Joy and Haddonfield, as well as new variants on each of the 5 Macmillan maps. And these changes have been broadly excellent. There have been a few neutral to bad changes, like Garden of Joy more or less staying as bad as it ever has been, and Rancid Abattoir turning out a little more killer-sided than maybe it should be, but for the most part the reworked maps have been massive improvements, and I even like the new Macmillan maps more than most of the old ones. Mother's Dwelling, Fractured Cowshed, Haddonfield. These maps should no longer be making every killer player crap their pants, and that by itself is worth recognition. Like, I can't believe I'm living in a world where 2 of my favourite maps are Mother's Dwelling and Suffocation Pit. And if maps keep releasing and reworking to the quality of Year 8's, I think it's only going to get better from here. Please, I see what you did to Cowshed and Mother's Dwelling, and I want you to do that to Badham and Disturbed Ward. Just get the bulldozer in, flatten those maps and start again. Come on, behaviour, you know you want to.
But in the Fires of Mount Doom, another map was made. Or should I say, remade. A little map I like to call Hawkins National Laboratory. And I like to call it that because everybody else calls it that because that's its name, but you know, semantics. Because the third unequivocal success of Dead by Daylight this year is something players have been wanting basically since we lost it. The return of the Stranger Things chapter.
It says a lot that the Alien chapter, the anticipated arrival of one of the biggest horror IPs of all time, raised DBD's Steam chart player count by less than the return of Stranger Things to the game, which is particularly impressive when you realise the only gameplay change to people who already owned the chapter's contents was the return of Hawkins Lab to the map pool. Losing the Stranger Things license, which was one of the more popular licenses with fairly beloved gameplay in more or less every respect, was a major shaking point for the community, and player speculations around its return were starting as soon as it left, fueled by a mixture of uncharacteristic optimism and raw copium. But players finally got what they wanted in Year 8, and the Demogorgon, Steve and Nancy and their cosmetics returned for available purchase. No more new players feeling awful they missed out on demo. It's a great thing for the coherency of this game, and it raised a lot of confidence in behaviour this year. So the return of Stranger Things makes it onto the list of best things in Year 8.
But after this year's long run of successes, I don't want to give the impression that it's all sunshine and rainbows. I think the biggest problem with Dead by Daylight Year 8 can be expressed in something a lot of people are going to be sympathising with me about, and that's the perks. Not just individual meta breaker perks, mind you, because every year has those, but DBD Year 8 has been characterised not by individually broken perks, but by incredibly strong perk combinations that interact in ways that are maybe unintended or a little bit too powerful, and that have unfortunately characterised much of the year's meta changes.
A classic example is For the People and Buckle Up. 2 perks that are powerful but fairly innocuous on their own, but get ratcheted up by their interactions with each other. For those who don't know, For the People can be used to instantly transfer a health state from one player to another, and Buckle Up gives 10 seconds of endurance to both the user and the person they're healing when the user picks somebody up from the dying state. This with For the People can instantly pick a survivor up in the killer's face and give endurance to both survivors in this interaction. No matter who you hit, they are invincible, and if this 10 seconds, and therefore 40 meters of distance, happens to get them to any resource at all, congratulations, that down you got just didn't happen. FTP Buckle Up is far from the only nightmare perk combo though. After its buff, Background Player is a ridiculously good perk on its own, since it lets you get flashlight and pallet saves from across state lines. But pair it with Flashbang, which can be thrown effectively through the killer to blind them when they're facing a wall, and you have what's effectively a free save once a minute, if you keep doing gens. The killer picks up their down, you Sonic the Hedgehog over at 200% speed to get your save, and the speed boost lasts long enough to get you back to your gen safely to start charging another bang. And as of the last mid-chapter update, the ancient enemy that was Decisive Strike Unbreakable has reared its ugly head once more, and Year 8 has given it some brand new toys to play with. For the first time in history, a 5-second Decisive Strike can be paired with a full 80 seconds of endurance from off the record, meaning you can get off of hook with a functional 3 health state and have 0 punishment for using them aggressively for a full minute. You can body block for the unhooker, you can threaten a flashlight or pallet save, you can interact with killer items like the Lament Configuration or EMPs, and you can even get healed. All while wearing what is effectively a suit of armour, protecting you from the killer punishing your hubris. And it doesn't stop there. The old classics like Deliverance to let you unhook yourself in the killer's face with the full protection of DS, or Unbreakable to counter the killer waiting out DS by slugging you, are still around as strong as ever. But now you've got perks like Wicked to give yourself Deliverance for free if you can force a basement hook. Almost worryingly, Plot Twist, because why make the killer down you and force Decisive Strike out when you can just down yourself? If you have DS and Plot Twist, you can take aggro from the killer and then down yourself, meaning the killer either has to pick you up and then eat a 5-second stun, or leave you on the ground to heal yourself to healthy and then speed boost away. And this can be done off taking a hit with off the record at no cost to the survivor. None of these perks are necessarily insane on their own, but when combined together you end up basically indestructible in a wide variety of horrible ways. Let me be clear here. This obnoxious pairing of perks that interact a little better than they should isn't a survivor exclusive problem. Pop and Pain Resonance together can obliterate any generator on a fresh hook, and Grim Embrace Dead Man Switch giving up 4 map-wide deadlocks a match isn't really much better. But where I'd argue the difference is between Survivor and Killer perk combos is that the Killer perk combos are somewhat skill expressive on both sides, whereas the Survivor combos are only skill expressive for the side using them. Think of it like this. Grim Embrace DMS is really obnoxious and carries a lot of bad killers, but it is at its most effective when one of the following two things is true. The killer is good enough to get downs quickly and consistently, or the survivors are bad enough to get 2-tapped every chase. If the killer can't end chases quickly, whether that's from their own mistakes or from the survivors playing really well, the perk's effectiveness is mitigated. This does not apply to the survivor meta perks at the time though. Being in the right position to use XP Buckle Up, or having the timing down for a flashbang save with background player, might take more coordination than just sitting there on a generator with a thumb up your ass, but from the killer's perspective it doesn't matter how good they are. If the survivor is in a position to get it, they'll get it, and there's nothing that you can reasonably do to prevent it. If anything, a good killer might be more affected by these perks than a bad one, because these perks only do anything at all if the killer is capable of downing people consistently. When you go down early and your teammate gets the gen Pain Res pop before they could finish it, you can say to yourself, wow, these perks are really stupid, but if I'd lasted longer in the chase, they might have gotten it done in time. When you lose or down to a survivor background playering across time zones and throwing a flashbang through you to save a survivor even though you're sniffing a wall, you can't think to yourself, I could have played better to avoid this, because you couldn't. You think to yourself, fuck it, next time I'll just put Lightborn on. If you're getting hit by DS Plot Twist because some moron is body blocking you off the hook with their cornucopia of health states, skillful play will not help you there. Guess you should have just played Pyramid Head so that you could cage them, or never hook the survivor in the first place and just bled the fuckers out instead. If you're getting hit by a Buckle Up, guess you should have just injured the entire team and somehow prevented any of them from resetting before downing somebody. How dare you allow any survivor to be healthy at any point in the match? Shame on you. Of course there's been some obnoxious individual perks, most clearly made for this Ultimate Weapon, but these have both been dealt with within the year they released, leaving just the absurd perk combos unaddressed. And it's interesting to me how for the most part these combos tend to come about from behaviour over buffing older perks without considering their interactions with newer ones, instead of releasing new ones that break the meta. Background Player, Dead Man Switch, Buckle Up, Decisive Strike. The only new perk of the year that consistently makes these situations uncounterable is Plot Twist, and that's largely just doing what Unbreakable was doing anyway.
So, that has been a major issue. I'd argue actually the major issue with Year 8 of Dead by Daylight. Behaviour continuing to push out, let's be honest, poorly thought out perk combos that have accentuated the worst pain points of playing this game. But Behaviour's love of creating powerful and synergistic perk combinations has led to something quite impressive, a major selling point of Year 8 for me, and that has been how good the experience has been just playing Survivor.
Now, I know what some folks are going to say, but I'm being completely serious. I'm not a new player, I've been playing since 2018, and for the most part I didn't find Survivor terribly interesting. But Year 8 has given the role a new lease of life for me, and there's a number of reasons why. The biggest one by far being the massively increased perk diversity options Survivor has nowadays. Sure, you've got Fuckle Up, Background Player Flashbang, or the insanely strong Anti-Tunnel, but there's so many good options now for perks and perk combos beyond that either involve new perks from Year 8, or fresh buffs on older perks. A great example is Dramaturgy and Vigil. Dramaturgy exhausts you between uses, so Vigil lets you get more use out of it, meaning you are generating items so quickly you'll be able to open a shop right there in the fog like the merchant in RE4, but it also reduces the duration of exposed effects, so if you get unlucky on a Dramaturgy RNG, Vigil might just bail you out. Neither perk is bad on its own, but it's a fun and effective combo even if it's a little off meta, and it's far from the only combo Year 8 brought. You've got Deadline that you can use alongside Autodidact, Stakeout, Fogwise or Hyperfocus to guarantee you get enough skill checks to get value out of all your perks. Quick and Quiet and Lucky Star to bamboozle killers in the chase even when you're injured. The Flip-Flop Power Struggle build got beefed up with introduction of Plot Twist. Strength in Shadows enables lightning fast self-healing with botany knowledge at a speed we haven't seen since Circle of Healing was meta. You can run Made for this alongside Off the Record, Dead Hard or a Styptic to manually unnerf the perk and gaslight killers into thinking that you're speed hacking. You can even run Quick Gambit alongside Troubleshooter, so you can see which gens are being done, run the killer over to them and thoroughly sandbag your teammates while pretending your perks are actually doing something.
But my favourite perk of the year is the most combo-tastic of the lot, and it's been a mainstay of what's made Survivor fun for me ever since the arrival of the Alan Wake mid-chapter. Show me the Champion of Light.
Champion of Light is by itself a pretty solid perk. It gives you half an exhaustion perk of distance whenever you blind the killer on a pallet and lets you position for saves more easily. But much like a Che Guevara shirt or a guitar solo by Jimi Hendrix, it just goes with everything. You want to burn the killer's retinas out at a pallet and escape round a corner, run it with Parental Guidance or Residual Manifest. Run it with Chemical Trap if you want to hinder the killer so badly they're going slower than a survivor's walking speed. Run it with Background Player or Flashbang if you want to bring dishonour on your family. My favourite perk choice to run with Champion of Light though is Fixated, because with the stacking movement speed boost you end up moving while holding a flashlight out at 3.86 meters per second, which is damn close to Survivor's normal running speed without actually counting as running. This gives you loads of options to use it creatively. You can use your flashlight to turn off scratch marks without losing distance, use it to break chase and reset the killer's bloodlust, or even recover your exhaustion so that your 99 sprint burst or life can be recovered without losing distance. And that isn't even taking into account its effect on killer powers. If a killer like Huntress, Billy or Chucky is trying to hit you within flashlight range, you can just shove the flashlight in their face and force them to simultaneously aim the power to hit you while not looking directly at you and risking a blind. You're moving so fast that you're barely losing any distance doing this, and it's more consistent than you might think at being able to catch people out, so try it out one of these days.
But it pains me to say that while Survivor's had a massive array of interesting new perks and perk combos, I wish Year 8 brought Killer that level of freedom to bring a variety of interesting and powerful perks. In short, Year 8's Killer perk variety has been kind of ass.
Obviously Killer has their share of strong perks. We've gone over some already in this video. But between the lack of interesting new perks and the meta shift that 2024 brought, I'd say Killer perk diversity in general across the board power outside of the hard meta perks is pretty dire. In terms of new impactful Killer perks this year, I'd say we ended up with 3. Ultimate Weapon, Forced Hesitation and Friends Till the End. And of the 3, only Forced Hesitation continues to impress me. Ultimate Weapon released too strong. Way too strong, because it gave continuous free information throughout the match that survivors couldn't reasonably prevent, and that scaled with high ability killers spreading their terror radius across the map. This not only led to finding survivors being way too easy, but gave rise to some really obnoxious builds because the perk synergized with a lot of powers or killer items like jigsaw boxes, and perks like Dead Man Switch in frustrating ways. There's a reason Calm Spirit actually started to see some play this year. Thanks to Ultimate Weapon, everybody was screaming 24/7, and Calm Spirit was the only consistent counter to the perk. But when the nerf hammer came for Ultimate Weapon in the last mid-chapter patch, it came down brutally hard. And now it's still maybe a useful perk, it makes survivors scream around the locker that you opened, but much of what made the perk interesting and able to slot into a variety of builds has been ripped out. Its synergy with Terror Radius perks and add-ons like Dark Devotion or Iridescent Unpublished Manuscript is gone. It no longer has the utility it had on Stealth Killers where you could turn on your Terror Radius at will to control when survivors screamed, and it lost its specific utility on Mobility Killers who can move the Terror Radius around the map quickly. Now it's just a screamy nowhere to hide, that relies on Locker RNG to be even remotely useful, and that's a shame because it doesn't give you a good enough reason to run it anymore. Friends Till the End is in a similarly awkward spot. The perk is solid in theory, and has its utility on M1 killers who can travel the map quickly like Sadako, Dredge and Wraith. But let's not forget we live in an era where aura blockers have never been more prevalent or more powerful. Distortion has become a dime a dozen perk these days, and Off the Record, one of DBD's strongest perks, has almost 3 minutes of built-in aura blocking, while Friends to the End might be the most aura blocker vulnerable aura perk in the game. You see, most aura perks like Barbecue and Chili or Lethal Pursuer can potentially reveal multiple survivors at once, which limits the effectiveness of distortion against them, because distortion might bail out the perk using it, but not everybody else who isn't running it. But in the case of Friends to the End, the perk only reveals one person at a time and tends to rotate between obsessions as the match continues, meaning that eventually the one person the perk tries to reveal is going to be someone running distortion. When that happens, your perk will do absolutely nothing. Unless you can find the stealthing survivor and hook them to make somebody else the obsession, the perk will keep doing nothing for the rest of the match. Discounting Friends to the End, which is nice on some killers sometimes, but awkward to run in a meta full of aura blockers, Full Hesitation is quite literally the only new perk in Year 8 to be consistently useful enough to justify the perk slot, which kind of sucks when compared to the half a dozen new perks that Survivor got access to this year. And it's certainly not helped by the way that existing killer perks have been changed this year as well. Pop Goes the Weasel and Greer Embrace both got turbo buff this year, meaning we got a new slowdown combo flavour of the month that looks suspiciously similar to the last one. But unless you want to run the hard meta slowdown builds, Year 8 has hurt killer build diversity a lot more than it's helped. A lot of the consistent secondary role player sorts of perks that killers could run alongside slowdown have gotten nerfed, like Sloppy Butcher, Ultimate Weapon, and Save the Best for Last. And the rise of distortion off the record has meant that aura perks, traditionally the mainstay role player perk for a lot of killers, have never been less impactful. Don't get me wrong, aura perks can still be good, they just become less consistent than ever when the whole appeal was in their consistency. And when a perk that you ran because it was a consistent comfort perk stops being consistent anymore, you're likely going to stop running it. Stabiffle is in a similar spot. The perk was consistently useful across a lot of killers because it meaningfully boosted the lethality of otherwise shitty M1 killers, and could still be useful in some M2s like Deathslinger and Demogorgon. I'm not going to say I love Stabiffle Gorgon, I really didn't, but when Stabiffle got nerfed it more or less fell off the face of the earth. Between the inability to conserve stacks and the numbers decrease it got, the number of circumstances in which it will be worth the perk slot is much lower than it used to be. Especially with the endurance spam that we're seeing so much, allowing the obsession to take hits more easily. And Sloppy. Oh, my poor beloved Sloppy. For those who don't know, Mangle was given a timer in 750 where eventually the status effect will expire. For Sloppy, that Mangled timer is 90 seconds, and this has had two effects on the perk utility. Hit and Run with Sloppy took a significant hit because now you can't just lead them with Sloppy on them and then save them for later to chase somebody else. By the time later comes, they'll likely be healed and the perk will have done nothing. I know there are some folks who will be happy about this, but it gets far less effective when you're committing to chases with the perk because Mangled decays on hook or when slugged, meaning that between downing, picking, hooking and then waiting on hook to get unhooked, maybe half of your perk's value is going away. And this is particularly rough for killers who often injure with an M1 but down you with their power, like Twins or Oni, because now you apply it on first hit, and by the time they get downed, hooked and unhooked, there's a high chance it's gone completely. Again, I'm not saying Sloppy is some unusable garbage now, it's just less consistent than it used to be. And in a world where killer perks need to get you consistent value to be worth the perk slot, it just doesn't make it an appealing choice.
Let me be clear here. I'm not saying you have to run super stacked meta slowdown to win a game. It really isn't that complicated. You don't need that. Just like you don't need buckle up and fall to people to win consistently as Survivor. But Survivor has had a ton of options this year that have allowed for interesting, creative and useful builds even when you're not running the hard meta. Stuff that's not overpowered, but still powerful enough to give you a good reason to run it, to be a fun and interesting alternative to the humdrum normal perks. And let's be honest, Killer just doesn't have that. There's still a number of consistent secondary good value perks, but that number is slowly dwindling. It isn't being replaced by any interesting new perks either. And this pool of perks only getting smaller means that the killer has less and less reason not to just run the hard meta stuff, because at this point, what the hell else are you going to run? The only reason they wouldn't is either just for the challenge of it, or because Agitation, Bamboozle, or End Fury happens to get their rocks off while also being useful on the killer they're playing.
Between stealth perks being mitigated by comms, open maps and half the killers being louder than jet engines, aura blockers limiting the value of aura reading perks, and chase perks only being worth it on a fraction of the killer roster if they're strong enough to be run at all, killer perk diversity is terrible, and Year 8 has only made the issue worse. Admittedly, it's not all doom and gloom. The Ruin buff has made the perk regain some relevance this year and could see Hex builds making a return once again.
Tell him the bitch is back.
And Lightborn of all perks has become a seriously relevant pick because it's the main and often only counter to otherwise uncounterable blinding perks like Champion of Light, Flashbang and Background Player. But with many perks nerfed out of relevance and the bevy of useful perks Survivor has received this year, it's hard for me not to put killer perk diversity on my list of the worst parts of Year 8.
Okay, so I've been harping on about perks for way too long, so let's start talking about releases, and I want to start off by talking about two absolute blinders. Releases that, in every way, raise the bar of quality for future licensed content. One was a modern horror classic, one that's been raking in praise and awards basically for as long as it's been around, and that blessed Dead by Daylight with a forensically faithful thematic adaptation that made the gap between source material and DBD almost completely seamless. And the other was an iconic and unforgettable solo release that used the comic tone and inherent absurdity of its source material to bring a general sense of joy with off-the-wall gameplay design and brilliantly charming voice lines carried by the glowing personality of its subject. I'm of course talking about Alan Wake and Nicolas Cage.
Okay, I'm just going to say this now. Alan Wake was, in my opinion, the best release of Year 8. Alan Wake was not unlicensed many folks expected to crop up this year, and there were tons of reasons to doubt it. It's too new, it's too niche, there's not an easy choice of a killer candidate, but the Alan Wake half chapter demonstrated that you don't need a big Hollywood name to slot perfectly into DBD's roster. The likeness of Il Cavilli, and especially the voice of Matthew Perretta, brought the character to life in the fog brilliantly, and unlike most licensed chapters, the lore was given the same care and attention as the rest of the chapter. Sam, Lake and Remedy were let into the writer's room for Alan's lore, not that I'm jealous or anything, and both Alan's base lore and tome slotted perfectly into Dead by Daylight as a result, while keeping Alan Wake's identity and themes intact. And the perks were mostly bangers too. Champion of Light and Deadline have both led to some really interesting builds in combination with existing perks. Sorry Boon Illumination, maybe next time. Nick Cage's release back in late 2023 was a similar runaway success. Until the teaser got leaked, nobody could have possibly have seen it coming. A real-life celebrity playing himself in Dead by Daylight? It was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. And Behaviour got to have some fun with the inherent weirdness of this 1 in a million crossover, and with some fantastically off-the-wall perk designs to boot. Behaviour tends to keep RNG out of their perks for the most part, but Nick Cage's release embraces it, with dramaturgy being pretty much just a lottery every time you use it, and scene partner potentially making you just scream forever and ever and ever. Nick's heavy suite of voice lines mark the first time a character has been given this much, well, character in their voice work for Dead by Daylight, a trend that we followed up with Chucky and Alan Wake. And I can't believe I get to say this, but Nick Cage's lore is actually pretty good. There's not a huge amount of it, but the allusions to the Black Veil's activities in the modern day and the presence of one Pauline Stamper are something that we hadn't really seen in a while, and it wove Nick Cage into the world of DBD in a way that felt both completely natural to DBD and played into the bizarre and comedic nature of the Nick Cage release. After the Ash release felt pretty half-hearted in places, and Michaela was fun but didn't really go above and beyond and could easily have just fit into a normal chapter release, Nick and Alan have raised the bar for future Solo Survivor releases in a big way. I'm looking forward to seeing what Behaviour does to follow this up in Year 9 and beyond.
But let's look at the proper releases now, the full chapters with the new killers. And I'm going to say this, Year 8's releases have been broadly solid. In terms of the health of these releases and their impact on the game, they were broadly positive or at least inoffensive. Certainly improvement over the rockier terrain that we saw in Year 7.
Year 7's killers were Dredge, Wesker, Knight and Skull Merchant, and for at least some of these killers their reputations have been notoriously terrible. But just because Knight and Old Skull Merchant were absolute nightmares, we can't let the other two off the hook entirely. Dredge is an accessibility nightmare who makes last-gen consoles have a seizure whenever Nightfall goes off and is way too map dependent to be reasonable to balance. While the infection mechanic means Wesker is the CEO of tunneling and his collision and power hitboxes being unbelievably janky, leads to some frustrating experiences on both sides, especially if the Wesker is playing at high ping. But Year 8's killers have been mostly marked improvements in terms of their impact on the game, with one tiny plastic ginger exception I'll be getting around to later. Singularity, Xenomorph and Unknown have all added a lot of depth to Survivor gameplay that I can really appreciate, which is one of the reasons I think Survivor's been so much better this year. A lot of it boils down to the intuitive built-in counterplay these killers have baked into their kit. All three killers have very strong powers in a vacuum. Xenomorph is an incredibly oppressive mid-range zoner with a map-wide teleport. Singularity makes pallets and windows into an irrelevant detail with overclock while covering the map in pods for surveillance, and Unknown has a goddamn grenade launcher and his own passive mint rag in the hallucination mechanic. But despite all this power, they've been kept reasonable by consistent counterplay the survivors can do to mitigate their effectiveness. Be that EMPs to take out biopods and remove slipstream, flame turrets to waste the xenomorph's time in chase and create distance in areas that would otherwise be dead zones, or looking directly at the killer to prevent them from walking you down in the open, like a certain very frustrating Russian lady who throws fridges at you. These 3 killers have been broadly solid designs in my opinion, and I found all of them to be more fun to play against than they are to play, which, given that they're all pretty strong killers who definitely have their fans, probably means there isn't much bad I have to say about them. I have my issues with them that I'll go into a bit later, but for now I think it's safe to say that Year 8's killers have been broadly positive inclusions to the game. Well, most of them have. Chucky is the elephant in the room, the little plastic shitbag that has been the big black mark on Year 8's killer design, because I'll be real with you, Chucky might just be the single worst designed killer currently existing in Dead by Daylight right now. I don't know how long you lot have been playing this game, but I've been a bit of an old fart, and I remember when Release Legion existed. The killer design so catastrophically terrible that it came closer to actually killing DBD than any other release before or since. Old Legion's power was broadly similar to current Legion's, except a feral frenzy hit against a deep wounded survivor would take a chunk out of your mending bar, meaning that continuously frenzying the same person over and over again let you take them from healthy to downed exclusively using your power. This was, understandably, a fucking nightmare. And while it didn't make Legion necessarily overpowered because the power was on a significant cooldown and Legion back then was a 110 killer, so the chase times weren't unreasonably fast, but it meant that Legion had 0 counterplay because they could vault pallets and only a complete spanner was missing frenzy hits on a regular basis. They expressed 0 skill at any point between first spotting you and downing you, and it made every match against the Legion play out the exact same way because the power couldn't do anything else. So, a 110 killer with a power that could almost guarantee a down with very little skill expression on either side, but was completely reliant on that power due to being a 110, so they were forced into the same pigeonholed, repetitive, skillless gameplay on both sides. Wow, isn't this starting to sound familiar to you? Chucky is the closest DBD's come to Old Legion since Old Legion, including current Legion. And while Chucky isn't as bad as Old Legion, most of the issues that the killer had have been inherited by the little plastic piece of trash. Being chased by John Scamper tends to go like this. He's 110, so you're holding that W key like it's going out of fashion to waste much of his time as you can before you get to a resource. You start to loop it, he pops hidey-ho mode, and you're given a choice that's not really a choice. Either you greet the pallet, meaning Chucky will run you down with slice and dice and hit you with nothing you can do to prevent it, leave the tile, meaning Chucky will run you down with slice and dice and hit you with nothing you could do to prevent it, or you drop the pallet, meaning he will scamper it and hit you with an M1 or a slice and dice, with nothing you can do to prevent it. It's the definition of a no-win scenario, and one's limited only by the 18-second cooldown of hidey-ho mode. To be fair, there is a bit more about Chucky that it's physically possible for the killer to fuck up compared to Old Legion, but isn't that slice and dice's terribly challenging power to hit most of the time? The dash doesn't have impact collision, you don't lose distance winding it up, Chucky's third-person camera makes it easier to get effective on your environment to aim it, and his smaller size means he can hug a tile as tight as a survivor can. So the hardest thing about landing slice and dice most of the time is remembering that releasing M2 is what makes the attack go and stab the survivor instead of pressing M1 while holding M2. If you remember that, you should probably be fine. And let's be clear, Chucky was not always necessarily this linear. On release, he could flick his slice and dice beyond the 90-degree turn rate cap, which made the ability to scamper mid-dash actually useful, something which gave the character some depth. But when they removed his flicks, this mechanic was completely gutted. Now if you're going to try a mid-dash scamper, all the survivor has to do is run next to, behind, or to the side of the pallet or window, and he's physically incapable of ever hitting them. So why would you ever use the mechanic at all? All that removing Chucky flicks encourages his players to do is just dry scamper the pallet and not use the power until you need an instant pallet vault, because trying to use it creatively just robs you of any lethality you might have had against survivors with half a brain cell. Even with the nerf to scamper speed, Chucky is just a scamper machine, and the changes made to him have flattened down any depth the killer might otherwise have had, without addressing the fact that he's just Old Legion with check spots now. There's potential for a legitimately interesting killer power here if dry scamper was de-emphasised and slice and dice could be used more creatively. But Chucky's state right now is absolutely disastrous, and his release is kind of a stain on otherwise solid year of new killer releases. That being said, new killers were just a small part of the killer changes that came this year, because Year 8 brought back something that Year 7 very noticeably fell short on: balance maintenance and reworks to existing killers. Regardless of the quality of any of these changes, it's indisputable that behaviour has done way more to touch up the killers who needed changes this year than they did last year. Billy, Blight, Demogorgon, Hag, Trapper, Huntress, Doctor, Clown, Twins, Trickster, Skull Merchant, Pig and Sadako all got base kit changes this year. along with tuning done to all the new killers that came out this year after their releases, with the sole exception of the Unknown. And except some of the Huntress changes that gave Huntress haste add-ons and 7 hatchets for some reason, the tweaks have at least been generally good. Nice number changes to some killers you could do with the help. But when we started to look at reworks, things get a bit more complicated.
This year has featured major changes to Billy, Blight, Sadako, Trickster, Twins, and Skull Merchant. And these have been a bit more of a mixed bag, shall we say.
Billy and Sadako were 2 killers this year who desperately needed some love, and I'm pleased to say they got it. Don't get me wrong, neither rework is perfect. Sadako's still a bit on the weak side, while I think Billy went perhaps too far the other way. I can't say I love the fact that Overdrive affects recovery speed after missing a saw, or that his enhanced mobility lets him tunnel anywhere on the map because he moves at the speed of sound, and low pro still exists, so fuck that add-on with a shovel up the jacksie. But it was still a generally good rework that made Billy much more accessible to pick up and raise his skill ceiling with the increased options that Overdrive gives you. It was everything Billy players wanted, and I'm glad they got it. Blight and Trickster, however, those guys got the short end of the stick. To Trickster's credit, he at least got more bearable on console, but that came at the cost of more or less everything schizophrenic about the killer. And to tell you more about that, I've drafted in someone who knows more about Trickster than I ever will, my friend Gorbo, who's one of the best Trickster players you will ever see.
Ever since his release over 3 years ago, the Trickster has been a very divisive character. It felt like among the general community, people either hated him or loved him, even if it was only for his looks. But for me personally, I haven't been able to find a more enjoyable video game character since I picked him up. On paper, this killer is dead simple. You hold down the fire button, and you throw knives very fast. You had to hit 6 of them within a short time span to injure a survivor, but the fast fire rate made this manageable. While it sounds simple when I put it like that, once you really sat down and grinded this killer, you had access to a basically uncapped skill ceiling. And the best part is, that skill expression was rewarded with some of the consistently faster chase times you could find in the game. Survivors had to be cautious around you, because if they gave you an inch, you could take a mile. Not only could Trickster trap survivors in loops with the threat of his knives, if they slipped up, they'd get mowed down, which made him very dangerous and sometimes frustrating to play against. However, on top of being stuck as a 110 killer, there were a lot of subtle mechanics in place to keep his power level in check. Once he began throwing, it actually took him a while to reach his maximum throw rate, because his throwing speed would actually gradually increase the more knives you threw instead of just being a flat rate. As you threw knives, a subtle recoil would kick in, forcing you to adjust your aim to compensate. And as you threw faster, your movement speed would decrease, causing you to lose a little bit of distance. These mechanics were meant to subtly nudge you towards the real bread and butter gameplay loop of Trickster: tap firing. When you tap fire, none of these mechanics affected you. You could throw perfectly accurately without recoil, you didn't have to adjust to the increased throwing speed, and you suffered no movement speed penalty. And thanks to Trickster's extremely fast wind-up and cooldown, you could easily switch from the throw state to running on the fly, losing minimal distance while still applying pressure to the survivor's health state. This gameplay loop was so fun and satisfying to optimize. Every little hole in the wall, boarded up window, and structure with a gap in it can be used as an opportunity to sneak in a cool shot if you have the skill to pull it off. And once that survivor tried to leave a loop, that was the moment that you'd hit them with rapid fire. All of this culminated in a killer that felt more reliant on skill than luck. If I played poorly and missed tons of shots, I'd not only end up stuck in chase way longer, but I'd be more likely to run out of ammo and have to spend time reloading, losing the chase altogether. So while I may have done a good job selling this killer to you on paper, truthfully, he wasn't that strong. Being 110 hurt him a lot, as he simply took longer to catch up to survivors than most other killers. And he lacked the range of Huntress, the speed of Spirit, and the on-demand reload potential of Deathslinger. So even though he was mostly fine as is, a buff could have come at any time and would have been welcome. Until... yeah, it took me this long to get to the actual update. Out of nowhere, the devs decided it'd be a good time to update Trickster alongside the release of Chucky. Remember before how I said Trickster had mechanics keeping his power level in check? Well, in this update, they were all getting removed for seemingly no reason. He now started at his previous maximum throw rate, no gradual buildup required. Recoil was gone, so there was nothing stopping you from throwing accurately at full speed, and the movement speed penalty was removed too, so you didn't lose any distance either. What was the point of tap firing anymore when you could just fire away at any point and not really be punished for it at all? On top of removing the entire skill curve of using the knives, they also removed the entire necessity of using the knives too, because they had increased his movement speed to be 4.6. Now it was far easier to catch up to survivors and zone them. Your zoning was way more lethal because you could hit more shots in a shorter period of time, and the knives were just flat out easier to use. It felt completely brainless to play, and dog shit to play against. To complement this insanity, the devs decided to buff Main Event too. And in case you didn't know, Main Event is just a mode that lets you throw a little bit faster with infinite ammo. That's it. It is purely a mode for spam fire, and you barely ever really used it in the old version of Trickster. And the reason you never got to use it before was because it took so much effort to get it to work. You had to hit 30 whole knives just to be able to use it once. 30 knives is the equivalent of 5 health states for old Trickster. Having to take 5 whole health states just to activate a mode that lets you throw a little bit faster really wasn't worth it. The base throw rate was already fast enough, not to mention the fatigue at the end, which made the ability way more committal and much more punishing if you mess up. So with all that in mind, what did they change about Main Event? What? Despite this sounding crazy, this basically changed nothing. They had already buffed his base throw rate to be almost as fast as Main Event anyway. All this encouraged was even more brainless spam, which is what Trickster was stigmatized for his entire existence. The one major side effect of this change was basically having infinite ammo thanks to an iridescent add-on, but that wasn't going to last long. To compensate for all the buffs, they also gave the killer 2 major nerfs, which just completely killed the playstyle I was talking about before. Now, instead of having to hit 6 knives to injure a survivor, you had to hit 8. And instead of having 15 seconds between hits before the meter began draining, you only had 10. These nerfs were not only brutal, but they were already tried. When Trickster released, he had to hit 8 knives too, and it was horrible. And when they later decreased the requirement to 6 knives, they also decreased the decay time to 10 seconds as well, which was promptly reverted back to 15 seconds just a week later. It's stuff like this that just makes this update feel completely aimless. Why are they trying to go back to the drawing board on Trickster when he was fine as is and just needed a couple little buffs to help him out? This update was insultingly bad, but at least we had another 3 weeks before it would come out on live servers, and maybe by then it would be salvaged, right? So they kept all the nerfs and all the quote-unquote quality of life buffs, which just made the killer less interesting and dynamic to play, and took away the biggest buff, being the throw rate. So what does that leave us? When we logged into the live servers to play Trickster, we were stuck with the slowest possible throw rate from before, being 3 knives per second. So on top of having the slowest throw rate, you also had to hit more knives than before, and you had less time to hit them. And since they removed his fastest throw rate, we basically have to use Main Event as a replacement now, which still has its problems that I mentioned before. Unfortunately, the Trickster player base did not have enough clout to be able to roll back the changes before it was too late. Our killer was dead, and there was nothing we could do about it. But hey, at least tap firing was still here, right? He did later get buffed a little bit in a bug fix patch, but this really didn't help. They increased the default throwing speed a little bit, and they also reverted the laceration decay time to 15 seconds again, which is just fucking hilarious. But all in all, this killer was still significantly downgraded from before, and I hope I made that clear with my little before and after comparison I've done here. I've already made forum posts and tweets about what I would change about Trickster, so if you're interested, you're free to check those out. And I'll probably expand on this topic a little bit on my own channel, but I don't want to take up too much of Will's time here, so I'm going to send it back to him. So yeah, like and subscribe, all that. Goodbye.
Hope it's clear now that Trickster was done pretty dirty in his update. but he's not the only one. God, the devs don't really know what to do with Blight, do they? Blight received 2 rounds of changes this year. A bunch of add-on changes and an adjustment that removed Blight's hug tech and made bumps more consistent. And this has had some strange effects. Hug techs are gone, meaning that Blight players that relied on them because they didn't want to learn the killer properly are now shit out of luck. But the changes have led to new problems, like double eerie add-ons now being pretty much playing the killer on creative mode. You can just do whatever you want and nobody can stop you. Meanwhile, Blight players have to deal with the nerf double speed, you know, the add-ons that gave Blight much of his high skill ceiling in the first place. While the Shredded Notes buff makes the issue that Blight always had, where he just break a pallet with spacebar and rain down in transition between tiles, worse than it's ever been. Blight's weaker than he was before, his only good add-ons make him encourage completely brain-dead playstyles, and now Hillbilly is treading on his toes. I don't like Blight, I never have. But the killer has been kind of robbed, and similar to Chucky, Year 8's changes have encouraged the most boring, low-effort and frustrating ways of playing him. I don't blame Blight players for moving on to Hillbilly at this point, because clearly a lot of them already have.
So we've got the good out of the year's reworks, and we've definitely had the bad. But I want to talk for a second about the Twins, because the Twins rework was just plain weird.
We've been waiting for the Twins rework for ages. And the longer that dedicated Twins enthusiasts like myself and Lynx waited for the rework, the more we were worried that the killer we loved was just going to get decimated, chopped and changed into something that which wasn't Twins anymore, and when the PTB hit, our fears were unfortunately proven right. Twins and the PTB were quite possibly the strongest killer DBD has ever had. They lost pretty much all their counterplay and their depth, and what made them Twins just didn't exist anymore. It was a catastrophic failure, and if it had hit live, this wouldn't have just been the worst thing of DBD Year 8, it would have been one of the worst things of any year, an unmitigated disaster. But after a rare unifying moment from the community as they yelled, "fuck that," behaviour saw sense and scaled the rework back to a series of quality of life changes and polish, the kind of thing Twins have always needed, and Twins enthusiasts breathed a sigh of relief. But then the release happened, and true to form, new Twins were bugged to the point of complete dysfunction. Now the camera snapped badly and Victor latched onto a survivor, he latched onto players with endurance when he shouldn't, Victor recovering from a missed pounce at near full running speed, so getting kicked after a missed pounce was almost impossible, and most concerningly, Victor could be recalled by Charlotte almost immediately after latching onto a survivor, which removed the counterplay from remaining healthy against Twins, and made them far more powerful than they had any right to be. Fortunately, a bug fix patch has just landed that fixed most of these issues, but doesn't change the fact that the road that we took to get here has been rough. And with all the old Twins bugs still around, with some questionable add-ons, and moving just a little bit too quickly after getting a pounce hit, I don't think we're at the end of the road yet. But separate from the spree of hit-and-miss reworks, I want to draw attention to something that, to me, is a little more frightening. And I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't even noticed it. Because, is it just me who thinks that the lore this year, for the new characters in Year 8, have been kinda bad? I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't. After 8 years, there's a lot of players who know nothing about the lore of this game. But it's a trend I've been noticing, and it's been quite concerning. And it's been hard to bring it up on the channel without sounding like a complete negative Nancy, but I can't ignore it. The original new characters in Year 8 were Gabriel, Singularity, Sable, and Unknown. And of those 4, 3 of them wound up giving me a sour taste in my mouth when it came time to read and analyse their stories. Unknown is hands down the best of the 4, as lore manages to adequately convey the sense of mystery and uncertainty that should be inherent to an urban legend-type cryptid creature. But it does unfortunately say a lot that the best new character story of the year is the one with going in depth on a character or story is actively discouraged. Being vague or somewhat nonsensical is part of the point of the Unknown, so writing it doesn't need coherency and well thought out character work. If anything, it benefits from a lack of coherency. The other 3 characters have not been so lucky. Sable, Gabriel, and Singularity have all suffered from the same problem, and it's a problem that never really happened consistently with the new character releases before. Their stories on a fundamental level just don't make sense. I want to compare this to Year 7 here, where the stories are more of a mixed bag. Some characters had really good lore, like Talita, Hanato, Hadi, and Dredge. We started to see some problems with Skull Merchant and both editions in the Forge and Fog chapter, Vittorio and the Knight. All 3 of these characters had something missing in their stories. Vittorio lacked realism with the way that he looked, and presented in his story not really fitting with the idea that he was some medieval lord lost out of time. Knight lacked relationships, since the guards who are apparently so important to Tarosh's character that he takes them with him into the trials, didn't have their relationship with him explored at all. and Skull Merchant lacked detail, because while her story was very long, it spent way too much time focusing on her childhood and her father's manga career, and not enough time exploring her life as a rich murderous CEO lady hunting people on the weekends, which really should have been the core of the character, the emphasis from the beginning. These stories all worked on paper, but came up short and incomplete in practice. Each story was missing something, stopped it being as good as it could have been. Year 8 stories were not like that, because Year 8 stories at their core were just straight nonsense. They were chock full of logical inconsistencies, plot holes, weird character choices that don't pass the sniff test. They're not incomplete, they're just a bit crap. And Transmission's shared story for Hux and Gabriel was a hodgepodge of misused tropes and extremely questionable story elements that leave you wondering what the hell you meant to even be reading. For example, Gabriel's entire job, the reason the corporation cloned him into existence, was to maintain the robots and machinery on the Dvalka expedition, but it takes the systemic extermination of 80% of his fellow crew members and all of the robots he's meant to look after over at least 36 hours on the base before he thinks to, check the computer system that it's his entire job to maintain and that'll tell him exactly what's wrong as soon as he does check on it. If that's not bad enough, how about Hux managing to sneak up on and take out the other robots on the base minutes after telling the reader that all the robots know where each other are at all times, without the writer realising that this would make Hux sneaking up on the robots and taking them out one by one a little bit challenging. Or maybe you'd like to hear about how Hux somehow suffocated 7 people to death in their beds in minutes on a planet established to have a breathable atmosphere. And let's not forget Sobel, who was so obviously shoehorned into Michaela's backstory with all the care and elegance of a prostate exam with Ash's chainsaw hand. For all her rampant popularity, El Sable is a complete joke that can't be taken seriously, although to be fair to her, that might be the point. But regardless of how intentionally Sable was a complete laughingstock, the fact is that she was, and after the shambles of End Transmission's lore and the lackluster stories of the Alien Chucky chapters, that's just a bit underwhelming, frankly. An incomplete story can be completed with a good tome. Look at Skull Merchant, who got fleshed out considerably as her tome patched up many of the holes in her base lore. It's happened to older characters too, like Hillbilly and Wraith. But a story that just doesn't work on a fundamental level is pretty much unfixable. And these stories have been the hallmarks of Year 8's original releases. Compared to Year 7, but especially the amazing original storytelling of Years 4 and 5, it just doesn't measure up anymore. However, I'll give behaviour law writers one thing. While the new original characters this year have been pretty underwhelming, the bulk of the tome stories in Year 8 have gone to older characters, and these have been broadly excellent. Aside from Tome 16, which is pretty much the definition of polishing a turd, and the survivor story of Tome 18, which put the spotlight on Alan Wake, Tome 17 through 19 all featured older characters who've yet to receive follow-up stories. Oni, Deathslinger and the Artist for Killer, and Feng Min and Zarina for Survivor. The killers were all done super well. Oni got a follow-up that showed us all a bit more of the man behind the massacres, without compromising the anger and pride that defines him. Deathslinger's relationship with the Hellshire gang he recruited got fleshed out enormously in a way that makes the Guardia Compagna look like polite acquaintances. An Artist might be the best of the bunch, since her base lore had tons of problems with character agency and the general torture porn vibe of the story, that the tome completely overhauled to tell an emotionally resonant and deeply fascinating story. The survivors were the surprises though. Zarina might just have the best Survivor tome story ever written, and Min, after years of being flattened down into a cartoon version of herself to sell endless cosmetic collections, finally being able to have the darker elements of her story properly appreciated. And all of this was capped off by the formal return of the old tome system, where older characters got prioritised over newer ones for follow-up stories and cosmetics in the tomes. This was a system I've been highly critical of since its inception, and as of Tome 19, behaviour seems to have completely walked it back, which is awesome to see.
So with the new releases, the reworks, the balancing, the lore, all of it, I think my final verdict on Year 8 can be summed up as adequate. Not exciting, not catastrophic, just adequate. And here's where this subjective list gets even subjectiver. Even though Year 8's killers were broadly healthier than Year 7's, I just don't find them to be interesting. I feel less satisfaction towards the killer list this year than I did this time last year. And that's really strange.
Because don't get me wrong, I didn't click with Year 7's killer releases basically at all. I liked Skull Merchant as a character, but even then I knew there was something deeply wrong with her, and don't get me started on the back-to-back snooze fest of Wesker into Night. But at least the end of Year 7, I could say I wasn't surprised, because Year 6 had brought 2 characters I really liked, Pinhead and Artist. So for Year 7 not to have anything at all that fit in my particular tastes wasn't surprising. I could just shrug my shoulders and say, oh well, there's always next year. But that always next year has now come. And in terms of new killer releases, it's just been another 12 months of nothing special. Unknown's alright. Not a killer I'm rushing to play more, but definitely an inclusion I rate higher than anything Year 7 brought, and Chucky sort of fits into the Wester category of this isn't for me and was never going to be. I'm just glad the Chucky fans got what they wanted. No, these two are not my problem. My biggest problems with Year 7's new releases have been Alien and especially End Transmission. Alien is a series that I adore, and a license I was really excited to have in DPD, but now that it's here, I can't help but feel it pulls its punches a little in terms of delivering on the idea and themes of Alien, on truly bringing the horror of the series to life. Similar to Nemesis, I don't believe the power we ended up with capitalised properly on the esoteric and, well, alien nature of the non-human threat. Just giving us another standard M2 projectile with a tail attack coupled with a teleport. Neither of these feel particularly innovative or unique to the Xenomorph, and in my opinion they're not even fun to use. Compared to something like Pinhead, which was a pitch-perfect integration between theme and gameplay, or even Chucky, which despite being a power that's a boil on the face of Dead by Daylight, was at least a win on theme and vibes alone, Alien feels flattened down and sanitised, and as a result incapable of living up to its potential. From the cookie cutter power, to the bizarre map, to Ripley's face that's nowhere near Sigourney Weaver. I wanted to really love the Alien chapter, but I just couldn't. Could have been worse though. It could have been End Transmission. End Transmission could in theory have been a chapter that worked for me, and there's a lot about it that I do quite like. Toba Landing has been one of my favourite maps. Gameplay wise it's fairly well balanced, and next to the abandoned buildings or desolate woodlands with the rest of DPD, Toba is teeming with life. It really makes the most of its alien setting to give us a map unlike any other. Some of the perks are pretty cool too. Troubleshooter is a great solo queue perk, and Full Hesitation is one of the very few killer perks released this year that's done anything at all. My problems with End Transmission are in Gabriel's perk made for this, Hux's visual design and power, and the lore of both characters in general. I'm sure we don't need a reminder of how badly Made for This broke the game for the 9 months the perk ruled the roost before it eventually got slapped down with a nerf hammer. In case you weren't around then, Made for This gave you its 3% haste boost anytime you were injured, as long as you weren't exhausted. Meaning against any injured survivors, your chase was just 20% longer than it was going to be otherwise, with zero skill from the survivor and minimal reasonable counterplay from the killer. That's not even taking into account the endurance too, which just served as an extra fuck you to killers like Twins and Hag who might otherwise have not been able to worry about it too much, if it was just the haste alone that is. MFT used to be 3 to 4 to every lobby, and it made playing M1 killers utterly agonising, on top of the fact that it made identifying subtle speed hackers practically impossible because MFT was basically everybody running subtle speed hacks. Was that person moving slightly faster than normal hacking, or were they running Made for This? Could it have been both? Someone moving at 108% or 107 when they should have been moving at 103? But at least it got nerfed, ding dong the witch is dead, let's move on. I've already covered why Singularity's lore disappoints me so badly, but I want to talk for a bit about Hux's gameplay, because this is what really grinds my gears the most. You'd think that a character like this, setting up cameras and monitoring the map and all that sort of thing, would work for me. But it just doesn't, and that frustrates me so much, because a character that I was never going to like, that's fair enough, there's no point whining about that. But something that I actually could have really enjoyed that doesn't quite measure up is so much more disappointing. To be clear, I like Hux's elements of camera manipulation. I like it a lot actually. Its unique take on surveillance, map control and macro play, and the fact that EMPs exist to mitigate the egregious elements of the power instead of having to gimp it to make it balanced is a fantastic take on counterplay. What annoys me is, to put it simply, how bulldozery Singularity matches tend to devolve into. When I play Singularity, I find that EMPs are impactful enough to be really annoying outside of Chase, but honestly don't feel like I do enough in Chase. When I'm playing Singularity, the survivors I go against seem to almost never use EMPs in Chase. Whether it's because of the hinder that applies while it's being charged, the long charge time, whatever. The point is, EMPs just don't get used. Or if they are, they get used in a way that lets me reapply slipstream almost instantly, as if it was never used in the first place. This means that Singularity chases often devolve into feeding the killer pallets to instantly break, because looping against constant overclock without burning resources quickly is practically impossible, especially if you're running Serve Family Photo. The flip side of this is that when EMPs are held back this way, they only really get used to stymie your map control. If nobody's burning them in Chase, or getting value out of it when they do, they'll just get used to take out the pods you're using to control the map, meaning you just spend ages putting them back up again. EMPs used this way don't feel like they're countering you in a way that feels interesting to play against, so much as just making you do extra chores if you want to use your map control. But the map control is the part of the character that I really enjoy, so EMPs often turn out feeling like a punishment of not just playing him like Bubba, treating his power as just permanent end fury to clear pallets out, and overclocking in chase over and over again until you can bulldozer your way into a hit that the survivor can't really prevent. To have fun with the killer, I feel like I'm actively struggling against its own design. It's gotten to the point where I genuinely feel better losing to survivors using EMPs intelligently to actually prolong my chases than I do winning game just because I have really fast chases. Against smart survivors, EMPs feel like a resource you have to force them to burn through, and that adds depth to the killer. But if they're not using these resources smartly, the kill loses most of what makes them interesting to me. If they're just EMPing your map control pods and never using them in chase, you're probably going to win, but that win isn't going to feel good, at least to me. The macro play becomes unnecessarily time consuming and the chases feel completely one-sided as you bulldoze through the map resources. You see why this is such a pain point for me, right? This killer was the only eclectic map control option over the year's spree of mid-range zoners and dash killers, but against most teams the gameplay devolves into walking at you with overclock up over and over again, because the way many survivors use EMPs feels like it's punishing you for anything other than raw brute force. I'm not saying Hux is poorly designed or badly balanced or whatever, I don't think it really is that serious. I just don't find him to be exciting, and that is deeply disappointing because of all the killers this year, Hux came without a doubt the closest to being the kind of power that I would actually enjoy. This year, and if we're honest, the year before too, have just been content droughts for me. Long periods of time where nothing as a killer player catches my eye anymore. Interesting perks have been few and far between, and interesting killers have been practically non-existent. The last year of killer content has just been not my thing, and it pains me to say this over and over again every single time, but it's true. They just don't seem to make killers that interest me anymore. Well, I say that, but that's not entirely true now, is it? New Skull Merchant is not the best thing to come out of this year. The map changes, behaviours approach community feedback, Stranger Things has returned, all these things have been better for the game as a whole. But that doesn't matter right now, because the Skull Merchant rework is my favourite thing to release in the past 2 years. I said back in my first video on her that Skull Merchant in pretty much every way was almost the perfect killer for me. But there was stuff that held my enthusiasm back a bit. Yes, she is a walking reference to one of my favourite horror tropes, the rich arsehole who dehumanises their victims as part of fulfilling a sick and twisted power trip. But her base lore had too much emphasis on her childhood and manga and not enough of, well, that. Her look had interesting points to it, and a general vibe that I just loved, but was a bit confused in places and could have been more exciting. But behaviour pulled through for us. They gave her a tome that fleshed her out, they gave her tons of new cosmetics that always hit, and made my issues with her base design practically non-existent. Her power was still a problem though. While the idea of map control surveillance killer worked for me in principle, it created a lot of problems in practice. When the rework came in year 8, I was hoping it'd be a good one, and dear god it knocked my socks off. At long last, the suit finally fits. Well, it fits me at least. Oh no, that is much better, actually. Oh, that's much more like it. Oh, the glare's pretty bad. Let me just handle that. Oh, it's a good bit. Oh, shame. I know people don't like her, And I know that her skill floor is definitely lower than it should be, but I'll be honest, I don't really care that much. Like, yes, she has her problems, and I would like to see her get another round of changes to iron out some of her issues, but those issues can be addressed without changing what makes her current iteration so interesting. If you're going to give me a choice between a killer that definitely has her problems but provides something new to the killer roster that we've never seen before, that excites me to play this game again after 2 years of little interesting content, or yet another killer that's broadly inoffensive but that I'll get bored with after a week, I know which one of these two I'm choosing every single time. So what does she walks like a Vampire the Masquerade character? In all the ways that matter, she's pretty much a perfect killer. In every game I play, I tend toward disruptive playstyles where I can create problems for everyone and feel paid off for wrangling whole teams effectively. I love fucking with your plans before you've even had a chance to start executing them. It's why I play controlling playmaking tanks like Sigma, Wrecking Ball and Doomfist in Overwatch, or Stacks in Magic the Gathering. I enjoy proactive disruption, and Skull Merchant has that in spades, in a way that no other killer's got. She's a trap killer, one who interacts with her traps, survivors and the environment in ways that no other killer can. And leads to some super interesting situations, trying to laser tag people through objects, perfecting your rotation timings to hit people with a hinder or an injury at the perfect moment, or even using their post-hit speed boost to propel them into you for an instant down. She plays like no other killer, and that is awesome. Seeing survivors countering her intelligently makes me happy, and when they don't, you get moments like this. I know there'll be people who will be getting upset at me speaking positively about this character. God knows I get them often enough as it is. But getting a disruptive, set up and payoff killer with lots of tricks and things to learn and master is exactly everything I've ever wanted for a killer, and thanks to Year 8's rework, Skull Merchant is that now. And if this killer sounds interesting to you too, you want to learn about these things for yourself, there's a video even longer than this one I'd recommend you check out. Thank you to everyone who's watched and appreciated this guide, by the way. It was a huge project, and a lot of people who joined the Skull Merchant Club since it came out, or at least spoken to me about how they've softened up a little bit on the dislike for this killer. Slowly but surely, people are starting to soften up on Skull Merchant. Even some of the most stubborn figures in this community, and I can't thank you enough for helping me spread the word. Whose power was more or less a parasite on the game, and turned her into what's quite probably my favourite killer of all time. A macro management killer with a ton of skill expression that other killers just don't really express in the same way that she does. New Skull Merchant scratches that itch in my brain that no other killer has ever been able to really satisfy. When I'm playing her and it all hits just right, I feel more like a mastermind than the actual mastermind, and after 2 years of a content drought, you can't really put a price on that. She's been the only killer in the past year, okay, let's be honest, the last 2 years, to really stick with me for any longer than a week. And regardless of all the very normal and definitely not insane people who have been giving me so much shit about this killer ever since I picked her up, and will keep giving me shit in this video and beyond, it doesn't matter. Not a bit of it matters. Skull Merchant has reignited my joy in playing killer again, and that means she is the best part of Year 8, at least for me. So on that note, this actually is the end of the video. A peculiar ending to a peculiar year. A year of what I would broadly describe as unexciting competence. Punctuated by the occasional moment of madness and the extreme freak event of releasing accidentally my favourite ever killer. But while I'm glad that Year 8 ended up going the way it did, it's time to pitch up for a long rest and settle in for Year 9 and the critical 8th anniversary. Everybody roll for initiative, because I think we're in for one hell of an encounter.
Incomplete.
Stories go on and on, so many faces and names.